Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The morning sun glinted off the Pacific Ocean as Ethan Ward adjusted his goggles. At 21, he stood among the elite wave of competitors for the La Jolla Open Waters Challenge, a premier triathlon event that had drawn athletes from across the United States and beyond. Originally from South Africa, Ethan had moved to San Diego 3 years ago on a sports scholarship, bringing with him dreams of Olympic qualification and the competitive spirit forged in the waters off Durban's coast. The La Jolla Cove stretched. Before him, its waters deceptively calm. Race officials bustled around checking timing chips and confirming the course markers one final time. Orange buoys dotted the 2-mile swim course, leading out into deeper waters before looping back towards shore. Safety boats idled nearby, their crews scanning the water. Standard procedure for any open water event, but particularly important given La Jolla's reputation. "Nervous?" asked Marcus Delgado, a fellow competitor and Ethan's training partner. The 25-year-old Californian had been showing Ethan the local routes since he'd arrived, including the occasionally treacherous but beautiful La Jolla waters. "Just focused," Ethan replied, stretching his shoulders. His wetsuit felt tight, as it should. The water temperature had been measured at 64 degrees Fahrenheit, not cold enough to be dangerous, but cool enough to require protection for a long-distance swim. "Remember what I told you about the currents past the cove? They pull southeast. This time of year, don't fight them, use them." Marcus pointed toward the fourth buoy where the course turned sharply. "That's where people waste energy." Ethan nodded, though his mind was already retreating into the pre-race ritual he'd developed over years of competition. Behind him, spectators lined the beach, including his parents who had flown in from Cape Town to watch their son compete in what could be a qualifying event for the national team. His father, Robert Ward, had been a competitive swimmer himself, though never at this level. His mother, Anna, had never quite understood his fascination with pushing his body to its limits, but supported him nonetheless. 10 minutes to start," announced a race official through a megaphone. "Elite wave competitors, please enter the water for warm-up." Ethan waded into the Pacific, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline. The water was clear enough to see several feet down, revealing the rocky bottom that gradually gave way to sand and eventually the mysterious blue depths. He ducked underwater briefly, letting the cold shock his system fully awake. When he resurfaced, he glanced at the horizon, noticing the distant silhouette of a fishing boat beyond the course perimeter. "Perfect conditions," said Sophia Chen, a top-ranked female competitor who had positioned herself near Ethan. "No chop, good visibility." "Don't jinx it," Ethan replied with a half-smile. Superstition was as much a part of triathlon culture as carbon fiber bikes and energy gels. Race director Bradley Thompson raised the starter's horn. "Elite competitors, take your mark." The horn sounded, and 60 bodies lunged forward, churning the calm water into white froth. Ethan found his rhythm quickly, his powerful strokes propelling him into an early lead alongside Marcus and 2 other competitors he recognized from the circuit, Trevor Williams from Florida and Kyle Peterson from Oregon. The first buoy approached rapidly, and Ethan navigated the turn with practiced precision, avoiding the cluster of bodies that typically formed at these junctures. The second and third buoys passed in similar fashion. Ethan was maintaining third position, conserving energy for the bike and run portions to come. The rectangular course took swimmers parallel to the shoreline before turning seaward at the fourth buoy, where, as Marcus had warned, the current began to exert its influence. Ethan felt the subtle push against his left side and adjusted his stroke accordingly, maintaining his line toward the 5th marker. It was between the 5th and 6th buoys, nearly 3/4 through the swim, that Ethan first sensed something was wrong. The pack had spread out, with Trevor pulling ahead and Marcus dropping back slightly. Ethan found himself in an unusual pocket of space, alone in water that suddenly seemed vast. A shadow passed beneath him, too large to be another swimmer, too fast to be a trick of the light. His competitive focus faltered for a moment as a primal warning flared in his mind. In the waters off South Africa, he'd been trained to watch for certain signs, to respect the ocean as not merely a venue for human recreation, but the domain of creatures far more adapted to its depths than any person could be. 50 yards away, on the nearest safety boat, lifeguard Carlos Rodriguez noticed the lone swimmer's change in pace. Through binoculars, he observed Ethan's head lifting higher out of the water, looking around rather than maintaining the efficient side-breathing pattern of competitive swimming. Carlos nudged his colleague, Mike Brennan, and pointed. "Something's off with number 23, he said, referring to the number marked on Ethan's swim cap. "Let's move closer." The boat's motor hummed to life as Carlos steered it toward Ethan. Standard procedure was to approach struggling swimmers from the side to avoid potential collision. Underwater, Ethan couldn't hear the approaching boat. What he detected instead was a shift in pressure, a subtle vibration that experienced ocean swimmers recognize as movement, large movement. He increased his stroke rate, a decision born more from instinct than conscious thought. The sixth buoy was less than 100 yards ahead, marking the turn back toward shore. He never reached it. The great white shark, a 14-foot female that had been tracked sporadically by marine biologists throughout the Southern California coast, was not hunting, not in the deliberate sense. She had been drawn to the area by the unusual concentration of activity, the vibrations of dozens of kicking feet registering on her acute sensory system. In shark behavior terms, she was investigating. The initial contact was exploratory, a bump from below that lifted Ethan partially out of the water. He gasped, more from shock than pain, losing his rhythm completely as he frantically treaded water, trying to locate what had hit him. The safety boat was closing the distance, now 200 feet away. The second contact was catastrophic. The shark's powerful jaws closed around Ethan's right leg, just above the knee. In the world of shark attacks, researchers categorize bites as investigatory, hit and run, or predatory. This was the second type, a case of mistaken identity, where the shark would quickly realize that the wetsuit-clad human was not its usual prey, but such realizations offer little comfort in the moment of impact. Pain exploded through Ethan's body as he was dragged underwater. His training as a competitive swimmer saved his life in those first critical seconds. Rather than panicking and exhausting his oxygen, he held his breath and reached down, his fists connecting with the shark's snout and gills, areas sensitive enough that even a relatively weak human punch might trigger a release response. The shark let go, disappearing into the blue as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind a cloud of blood that expanded around Ethan as he kicked desperately toward the surface with his uninjured leg. He broke into air with a scream that carried across the water, reaching the ears of the approaching lifeguards and the more distant spectators on shore. "Shark! Shark!" Carlos and Mike had the safety boat beside him within seconds, their trained eyes taking in the blood spreading through the water and the nature of Ethan's injuries. Carlos reached over the side, grasping Ethan's wetsuit by the shoulders, while Mike prepared the first aid kit and emergency radio. "I've got you," Carlos assured him, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Try not to move." With practiced efficiency, they hauled Ethan over the side of the boat, immediately applying pressure to his mangled right leg. The wetsuit had been shredded, revealing a wound that extended from mid-thigh to below the knee. The shark's teeth had sliced through muscle and scraped bone, though remarkably the femoral artery seemed intact, the difference between life and death in such situations. "Mayday, Mayday," Mike spoke into the radio. "We have a shark attack victim at coordinates 32. 35 north, 117.27 west. Male, early 20s, severe leg trauma, massive blood loss, requesting immediate medical evacuation." The race director's boat was already speeding toward them, and in the distance, the wail of coastal emergency services could be heard. On shore, officials were herding remaining swimmers out of the water, the bullhorn announcements creating a chaotic symphony of noise that barely registered in Ethan's shock-addled consciousness. "Stay with me, buddy," Carlos said, applying a tourniquet above the worst of the damage. "What's your name?" "Ethan," he managed, his voice surprisingly steady despite the circumstances. Shock was setting in, the body's natural response to traumatic injury, temporarily dulling the worst of the pain. "Is it bad?" Carlos and Mike exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that comes from years of working emergency services together. "You're going to be all right," Carlos answered, a professional evasion that neither confirmed nor denied the severity. In truth, it was bad. Not the worst shark attack either lifeguard had seen in their careers on the California coast, but serious, enough to be life-threatening, without immediate medical intervention. The tourniquet was stemming the worst of the bleeding, but Ethan's blood pressure was dropping, his face growing pale beneath his athletic tan. The race director's boat pulled alongside, carrying the event's medical officer, Dr. Sarah Jenkins. She transferred to the rescue boat with practiced ease, immediately taking over assessment of Ethan's condition. "I need to get this wetsuit off to see the full extent," she said, pulling trauma shears from her kit. "Ethan, I'm going to cut your suit. You're doing great. Just keep breathing normally." The neoprene parted beneath the sharp blades, revealing the full extent of the damage. The great white's teeth had left a series of deep lacerations in a curved pattern approximately 20 inches across, consistent with the bite radius of a shark in the 12 to 14-foot range, though Dr. Jenkins kept this detail to herself. "Coast Guard helicopter is 4 minutes out," Mike reported, still on the radio. "They've alerted UCSD Medical Center Trauma Unit." Dr. Jenkins nodded, administering intravenous fluids through a line she established in Ethan's left arm. His blood pressure was stabilizing, but the blood loss had been significant. "You're doing great, Ethan," she repeated, maintaining the reassuring patter that was as much a part of emergency medicine as the technical skills. "The helicopter will be here very soon." Indeed, the distinctive thump of rotor blades soon became audible over the generalized chaos. The Coast Guard MH-65 Dolphin helicopter approached, hovering over the boats as a rescue swimmer was lowered to assist with the transfer. On shore, the scene had transformed from sporting event to emergency response. The remaining competitors had been accounted for, with Marcus among those helping to keep spectators back from the water's edge. Ethan's parents pushed through the crowd, their faces masks of terror as they realized the commotion centered around their son. "That's my boy," Robert Ward shouted at a race official who was trying to maintain order. "My son is out there." "Sir, please stay calm," the official replied, though his own demeanor was anything but. "We have a medical situation with one of our swimmers. Emergency services are handling it." "Is it Ethan? Is it my son?" Anna Ward demanded, her South African accent thickened by emotion. Before the official could answer, the helicopter rose from behind the safety boats, banking toward shore and then turning inland, carrying its precious cargo toward the waiting trauma team. The Wards didn't need verbal confirmation. The absence of denial told them everything. "We'll get you to the hospital," Marcus said, suddenly beside them. "My car is in the lot. I know where they're taking him." While the Wards were rushing to the hospital, Ethan was fighting the greatest race of his life, not for a medal, but for survival. In the helicopter, a Coast Guard medic monitored his vitals while administering blood plasma, a bridging solution until whole blood could be provided at the hospital. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain breaking through the shock in waves that correlated with the helicopter's movements. "ETA 3 minutes, the pilot announced over the intercom. "Trauma team is standing by." At UCSD Medical Center, that team was indeed ready, alerted by the emergency dispatch system that had been triggered by Mike's initial radio call. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, chief of trauma surgery, reviewed the incoming information on a tablet as she waited in the helipad receiving area. Shark attack victim, male, 21 years old. Multiple deep lacerations to right leg. Significant blood loss. Pressure stabilizing with field interventions, she recited to her team. OR3 is prepped. Blood bank is sending 6 units O negative. We'll assess vascular compromise and nerve damage once we have him stable. The helicopter touched down precisely at 9:47 a.m., just 33 minutes after the initial attack. The golden hour, the critical period where trauma intervention is most effective, was still very much in play. Ethan was transferred smoothly. From helicopter to gurney, the medical handoff conducted with practiced precision as the trauma team wheeled him toward the waiting elevator. "Ethan, I'm Dr. Rodriguez," the surgeon introduced herself, jogging alongside the gurney. "You're at the hospital now. We're going to take excellent care of you. Do you understand?" Ethan managed a weak nod, his consciousness buoyed momentarily by the movement and new voices. "My parents," he mumbled. "We'll contact them," she assured him, though she knew the hospital's patient liaisons would already be working on family notification. "Right now I need you to focus on staying with us." The elevator doors closed, carrying Ethan toward the operating room where the next phase of his fight would take place. Meanwhile, back at La Jolla Cove, the aftermath of the attack was unfolding. along predictable institutional lines. The remainder of the triathlon had been cancelled, an announcement met with no protest from competitors still processing what had happened. San Diego Lifeguard Services had deployed additional patrol boats, and a Los Angeles news helicopter circled overhead, capturing footage for the midday broadcast. Lieutenant Kevin Matthews of the San Diego Police Department's beach patrol unit had established a command post near the race director's tent, coordinating with lifeguards, Coast Guard, and county officials. Standard protocol for shark attacks involved clearing the water for at least 24 hours and conducting aerial surveillance to determine if the shark remained in the area. We need statements from the lifeguards who responded and any witnesses who saw the incident directly, Matthews instructed a junior officer, and get someone from Fish and Wildlife on the line. We need to know if there have been any recent sightings reported. Carlos and Mike had returned to shore after transferring Ethan to the helicopter, their rescue boat still bearing the blood, stains that would later be cleaned with the dispassionate efficiency of emergency services. Both men had been through the shark attack response protocol before. San Diego County averaged 1 or 2 serious attacks per year, though fatalities were rare. It was a great white, Carlos confirmed as he gave his statement. Didn't see it directly, but the bite pattern was unmistakable. I'd estimate 12 to 14 feet based on the spread. Investigatory bite, Mike added. Hit and run. Classic case of mistaken identity. The shark released immediately once it realized the swimmer wasn't a seal. Lieutenant Matthews nodded, noting these details. Despite public perception, such technical assessments were important, not just for safety protocols but for the broader scientific understanding of shark behavior. Each incident added to the database that informed future safety measures for ocean activities. Any warning signs before the attack? Matthews asked. Seal activity, fish behavior, anything unusual reported this morning? Both lifeguards shook their heads. Water was calm, visibility good, Carlos said. No bird diving, no bait balls. Nothing that would normally put us on alert. This was the unsettling reality of shark encounters. They often occurred without the dramatic foreshadowing depicted in films. Great whites, in particular, were ambush predators, their attacks typically swift and without warning. The fact that the race had stationed safety boats at regular intervals along the course had likely saved Ethan's life, allowing for a response time measured in seconds rather than minutes. As the official response continued, Marcus arrived at the hospital with Ethan's parents, having broken several speed limits on the drive from La Jolla to the medical center. The emergency department directed them to a private waiting area where Dr. Jenkins, who had accompanied Ethan from the scene, met them. Ethan is in surgery now, she explained, her manner calm but not detached. He suffered serious injuries to his right leg, primarily tissue and muscle damage. The orthopedic and vascular surgery teams are working together to repair the damage. Will he? Robert began, unable to complete the question. Ethan is young and extremely fit, Dr. Jenkins answered the unfinished query. Those are significant advantages in recovery from trauma. It's too early to make specific predictions, but the surgical team is optimistic. What she didn't say, what would become clear in the hours and days to come, was that optimism had gradations. Optimism might mean saving the leg rather than amputating. It might mean partial rather than complete recovery of function. It might mean walking with assistance rather than independently. The spectrum of positive outcomes was broad, and where Ethan would fall on that spectrum remained to be seen. Anna Ward gripped her husband's hand tightly. When can we see him? The surgery will take several hours, Dr. Jenkins replied. I'll make sure someone updates you hourly. There's a chaplain available if you'd like to speak with someone, and the cafeteria is on the second floor if you need anything. These were the routines of medical crisis. The waiting, the carefully measured information, the attention to basic needs that families often forgot in their distress. The wards settled into the uncomfortable vinyl chairs, prepared for the long vigil ahead. Marcus excused himself, stepping into the hallway to call their coach, Michael Thompson, who was already fielding calls from other team members and the Sports Federation. The news was spreading through the tight-knit triathlon community, generating the kind of focused concern that characterized athletic fellowships. It's bad, coach, Marcus said quietly. Really bad. They're not saying much, but I saw him when they pulled him out of the water. His leg. He stopped, the image still too fresh. I don't know if he'll compete again. In the operating room, Ethan was unaware of these conversations. the general. Anesthesia having transported him far from the pain and fear, Dr. Rodriguez worked methodically, assisted by Dr. James Chen, an orthopedic surgeon specializing in limb salvage. Anterior tibial artery is intact but contused, Dr. Rodriguez noted. Posterior tibial shows laceration with good distal flow. Perineal artery is severed. Let's ligate that one and focus on the others. Dr. Chen nodded, already assessing the damage to the tibial plateau and fibula head. Comminuted fracture of the fibula, he observed. Tibial plateau has a depression fracture on the lateral side. We can bridge that with a plate once we've managed the soft tissue. The surgical team worked with the focused intensity that distinguishes trauma surgery, urgent but not rushed, thorough despite the pressure. Units of blood were cycling through Ethan's system, replacing what had been lost and maintaining the pressure needed to perfuse vital organs. Significant muscle damage to the quadriceps and hamstring groups, Dr. Chen continued. Gastrocnemius is partially avulsed from its origin. We're looking at multiple reconstructive procedures after this initial stabilization. Agreed, Dr. Rodriguez said. Let's finish debriding the non-viable tissue and get temporary coverage. I want to close everything we can primarily, but I'm thinking negative pressure therapy for the larger defects. This was the reality of severe shark attack injuries. They were not single wounds, but complex constellations of tissue damage, each requiring specific attention. The serrated nature of shark teeth created tears rather than clean cuts, complicating the repair process. The force of the bite had compressed tissues and broken bones, adding crush injury components to the penetrating trauma. Hours passed as the surgeons worked, their concentration unwavering despite the length of the procedure. Outside the operating room, life at the hospital continued its rhythms. Other emergencies arrived, were assessed, treated. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the Pacific, the same ocean that had nearly claimed Ethan's life that morning. In the waiting area, the wards received their hourly updates, each one a variation on "surgery is proceeding." As expected, Marcus had been joined by Coach Thompson and 3 other teammates, forming a support circle that expanded further as afternoon turned to evening. Local news crews had gathered outside the hospital, held at bay by security, but persistent in their requests for information. Finally, at 7:23 p.m., nearly 10 hours after the attack, Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the waiting area, still wearing her surgical cap, though she had changed out of her blood-stained gown. Her face showed the fatigue of extended concentration, but her eyes were clear as she approached the wards. "Ethan is in recovery," she began, taking a seat across from them. "The surgery was complex but successful in its primary goals. We were able to save his leg, repair the major vascular structures, and stabilize the bone fractures." Relief washed over the ward's faces, though they remained tensely attentive, waiting for the qualifiers that inevitably followed such positive openings. "That said, I want to be very clear about the road ahead," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "Ethan has suffered severe trauma. The muscle damage will require additional surgical procedures over the coming weeks. He'll need extensive physical therapy, and while we're optimistic about functional recovery, it's too early to predict the extent." "Will he walk again?" Robert asked directly. "Yes," Dr. Rodriguez answered with the same directness. "With appropriate rehabilitation, I expect Ethan will walk. Whether he'll run, swim, or cycle at his previous level, that's a question I can't answer today. Ethan's youth and exceptional physical condition are significant advantages, but this type of injury presents substantial challenges even under the best circumstances." Anna wiped tears from her eyes. "When can we see him?" "He's in post-anesthesia care now. Once he's stable and awake, they'll move him to the ICU for the next 24 to 48 hours. You can see him briefly once he's settled there, though he'll be heavily medicated and may not remember your visit." As the wards processed this information, the hospital's public relations director, Melissa Torres, approached the group. "Dr. Rodriguez, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are several news crews outside requesting statements. The story has been picked up by national outlets." The surgeon nodded, unsurprised. Shark attacks, particularly during organized events, generated significant media attention despite their statistical rarity. "Mr. and Mrs. Ward, would you like the hospital to handle all media inquiries, or do you wish to make a statement?" "No statements," Robert said firmly. "Our focus is entirely on Ethan's recovery." "I understand completely. Torres assured them. We'll release only the standard confirmation that he's in stable condition following surgery. No details about his injuries or prognosis without your explicit permission. This was standard protocol for high-profile cases, balancing the public's interest in information against the patient's right to privacy. Despite the sensationalism that often accompanied shark attack coverage, most reputable media outlets respected these boundaries. As promised, Ethan was transferred to the ICU several hours later, a complex process given the monitoring equipment and medication drips necessary for his care. When the wards were finally allowed to see him, they found their son nearly unrecognizable beneath the tubes, wires, and bandages. His athletic frame, so powerful that morning, seemed diminished against the hospital linens. Anna approached cautiously, reaching for his left hand, one of the few areas not occupied by medical apparatus. "We're here, Ethan," she said softly, unsure if he could hear her through the sedation. "We're right here with you." Ethan's eyes flickered but didn't open. The cardiac monitor beeped steadily, displaying numbers that meant little to his parents, but told the medical staff he was stable for now. A nurse adjusted one of the IV pumps, checked the dressings on his leg, and made notes in the electronic chart. "He's doing well," she assured the wards. "The next 24 hours are critical for monitoring infection risk and vascular stability, but his vitals are strong." Robert nodded mechanically, still struggling to reconcile the son he had watched enter the water that morning with the patient before him. "Is there anything we should be doing?" he asked. "Just what you're doing now," the nurse replied. "Being here, resting when you can. This is a marathon, not a sprint." The irony of the athletic metaphor wasn't lost on either parent. Marathons had been Ethan's specialty within the triathlon framework, his running split typically compensating for any ground lost during the swim or bike portions. Now he faced a different kind of endurance test, one measured not in miles but in millimeters of tissue regrowth, degrees of joint flexibility, and increments of pain tolerance. As the wards maintained their vigil, activity continued around Yola Cove, though in a markedly different form than the morning's competition. County lifeguards had posted shark warning signs along the beaches, and a patrol boat remained on station overnight, though such measures were largely precautionary. The likelihood of the same shark returning to the area was minimal, according to marine biologists consulted by local authorities. The great white herself had indeed moved on, swimming southward along the coast. Despite the popular conception of sharks as mindless killing machines, research had conclusively demonstrated that they were selective predators who rarely targeted humans intentionally. The shark that had attacked Ethan had moved on after the initial bite, a pattern consistent with cases of mistaken identity rather than predatory behavior. By morning, she would be miles away, her primitive yet effective brain having catalogued the encounter as unproductive, the taste and texture of wetsuit and human flesh distinctly different from the blubbery seals and sea lions that constituted her natural prey. She would continue her solitary patrol of the California coast, one of several hundred adult great whites that called these waters home, largely unseen by the millions of humans who shared their domain. At dawn, the following day, Lieutenant Matthews supervised a helicopter survey of the coastline, coordinating with marine biologists from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, who volunteered their expertise in such situations. No sharks were spotted in the immediate vicinity of La Jolla Cove, though this was hardly surprising, given their extensive range and elusive nature. "We'll maintain the beach closure through tomorrow as a precaution," Matthews decided after consulting with county officials. Better to err on the side of caution, especially with the media attention. Indeed, by morning, the attack had made national news, with major networks featuring it in their broadcasts. The coverage followed predictable patterns: dramatic headlines about shark terror, file footage of great whites from nature documentaries, and interviews with witnesses who had been nowhere near the actual incident but were willing to provide colorful commentary. More responsible outlets contextualized the attack within statistical frameworks, noting that shark encounters resulting in injury numbered fewer than 60 worldwide annually, with fatalities in the single digits most years. Several featured marine conservation experts who emphasized the ecological importance of sharks and the greater statistical danger posed by everyday activities like driving or even taking selfies, which claimed far more lives annually than shark attacks. At the hospital, Ethan had been through his first post-operative night, a period marked by hourly neurological checks, pain management adjustments, and the constant vigilance of the ICU staff. By morning, he was intermittently conscious, though the combination of trauma, surgery, and medication left him disoriented. Water, he managed to request when he found his mother beside him during one lucid moment. Anna held a small sponge to his lips, providing moisture without the risk of choking that came with actual liquid. "You're in the hospital, sweetheart," she explained gently. "There was an accident during the race. Do you remember?" Ethan's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. "Shark," he eventually said, the single word carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "Yes," Anna confirmed, "but you're safe now. The doctors have taken very good care of you." He nodded slightly, then drifted back into sleep, before he could ask any of the questions forming in his mind. Questions about the extent of his injuries, about the competition, about what happened to the shark. These would come later, when the fog of medication began to clear. By mid-morning, Dr. Chen arrived to assess Ethan's condition, carefully examining the dressings on his leg without removing them. "Good capillary refill in the toes," he noted. "Distal pulses are strong. These are all positive signs." Later that day, two unexpected visitors arrived, Carlos and Mike, the lifeguards who had pulled Ethan from the water. They spoke briefly with the wards in the waiting area, offering the kind of perspective that only first responders could provide. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, Carlos told them. "Seen 3 serious shark incidents before yesterday. Your son did everything right. Fought back, stayed conscious, cooperated with rescue. Many people panic, which complicates everything." "He's a fighter," Mike added. "That makes a difference in these situations." There was an unspoken dimension to their visit as well. First responders often needed closure, needed to see that those they had helped in crisis moments were surviving, recovering. It was part of their own coping mechanism for a job that regularly exposed them to human suffering. As the second day progressed, more details about the incident began to emerge from official sources. The San Diego County Marine Safety Division released its preliminary report, classifying the attack as unprovoked and investigatory, based on the single bite pattern and the shark's immediate departure from the scene. The report estimated the shark's length at approximately 14 feet, consistent with a mature female great white, though without underwater footage. Such assessments remained somewhat speculative. The attack had also caught the attention of researchers from the Shark Lab at California State University, Long Beach, who maintained extensive databases on shark movements along the California coast. Dr. Amanda Nelson, the lab's director, contacted hospital administrators requesting permission to document Ethan's injuries for scientific purposes. Bite patterns provide valuable data on shark size, behavior, and feeding mechanics, she explained when the request reached the wards. "This information helps us better understand interactions between sharks and humans, potentially preventing future incidents." Robert and Anna were initially hesitant, concerned about their son's privacy and the potential sensationalism of such images. After discussion with the medical team, however, they consented to limited documentation once Ethan was stable enough to provide his own informed consent. By the evening of the second day post-attack, Ethan had been moved from the ICU to a private room on the surgical floor, a step down in monitoring intensity that reflected his improving condition. The critical period for vascular complications had passed without incident, and while infection remained a concern, prophylactic antibiotics seemed to be effective. It was in this new setting, with fewer tubes and monitors restricting his movement, that Ethan finally gained enough clarity to ask the question that had been forming in his mind since consciousness returned. "How bad is it?" he asked Dr. Rodriguez during her evening rounds. His parents stood nearby, having barely left his side since their arrival at the hospital. The surgeon paused, recognizing the importance of this moment. Medical professionals developed a sense for when patients were ready for unvarnished truth, versus when they needed hope emphasized over hard realities. Ethan's direct gaze and clear voice suggested he fell into the former category. "You suffered what we classify as a severe shark bite injury," she began, pulling up a chair to sit at eye level with her patient. "The shark's teeth caused deep lacerations to your quadriceps, hamstring, and calf muscles. You have comminuted fractures of the fibula and a depression fracture of the lateral tibial plateau. Several tendons were partially severed, and you had damage to 2 of the 3 major arteries supplying your lower leg. She paused, letting this information register before continuing. During the initial surgery, we repaired the vascular damage, stabilized the fractures with external fixation, and debrided the wound of non-viable tissue. You'll need additional surgeries to definitively repair the bone and soft tissue injuries, followed by extensive rehabilitation. Ethan nodded slowly, processing. Will I compete again? This was the question Dr. Rodriguez had anticipated, the one that competitive athletes inevitably asked, often before inquiring about more basic functions. It reflected their identity, their framework for understanding themselves, and their place in the world. I can't answer that with certainty today, she replied honestly. What I can tell you is that you're young, exceptionally fit, and have access to excellent medical care. Those factors significantly improve your prognosis. Returning to some form of athletic activity is a realistic goal. Whether that includes competitive triathlon at your previous level, that's a question we'll answer together over the coming months. Rather than despair, Ethan's face showed determination. Tell me what I need to do. This response, focusing on the actionable rather than dwelling on what couldn't be changed, was characteristic of elite athletes. Their training conditioned them to channel emotion into effort, to see setbacks as challenges rather than defeats. For now, rest and heal, Dr. Rodriguez advised. Let your body direct its energy toward repair. Once the acute phase passes, we'll begin working with physical therapy to maintain range of motion in unaffected joints. The real work starts after the definitive surgical repairs, which we're planning for early next week. As this conversation occurred, news coverage of the attack was already beginning to fade, displaced by newer stories, as is the nature of the media cycle. Local outlets maintained some focus, particularly as the beaches reopened following the precautionary closure, but national attention had largely moved on. The triathlon organizers issued a formal statement expressing concern for Ethan's condition and announcing a review of safety procedures, though they noted that all standard protocols had been followed, including the presence of safety boats at required intervals. While some participants and spectators criticized the decision to hold the swim in known shark territory, marine safety experts pointed out that such criticism reflected misunderstanding of shark behavior and population distribution. Great whites were present throughout California coastal waters. Their occasional visibility in certain areas created an illusion of higher concentration that wasn't supported by scientific data. By the 3rd day after the attack, Ethan was able to receive visitors beyond immediate family. Marcus was among the first, bringing well wishes from teammates and competitors alike. The Federation's talking about naming a sportsmanship award after you, he told Ethan, attempting to maintain the normal banter of their friendship despite the hospital setting. Though personally, I think getting attacked by a shark during a race should automatically qualify you for the Olympic team. Save everyone the trouble of trials. Ethan managed to smile, appreciating the effort to treat him as a teammate rather than an invalid. How's training going? On pause, Marcus admitted. Coach gave everyone a few days off after what happened. Nobody was much in the mood to push intervals. This was the rhythm they established over the next several days. Conversations that acknowledged the attack without allowing it to dominate every interaction. Ethan's mental health benefited from this approach, giving him space to process the trauma without being constantly reminded of it. Dr. Nelson from the Shark Lab visited on the 5th day after Ethan had consented to the scientific documentation of his injuries. She arrived with a photographer and a research assistant, their manner professional, but sensitized to the personal nature of their request. We greatly appreciate your willingness to contribute to our research, Dr. Nelson told Ethan, as the medical team prepared to change his dressings, creating an opportunity for photographic documentation without additional discomfort. Detailed case studies help us analyze shark behavior and develop better safety recommendations. As the bandages were removed, revealing the complex geometry of sutured wounds, temporary fixation devices, and vacuum dressings, Dr. Nelson maintained a clinically detached demeanor that nonetheless acknowledged the human element. Each shark species leaves distinctive bite patterns, she explained to Ethan and his parents, focusing on the educational aspect rather than the graphic nature of the injuries. Great whites tend to create deep puncture wounds at regular intervals, reflecting their triangular serrated teeth. The spacing here, she indicated without touching, confirms our initial size estimate of 13 to 14 feet. Robert, who had developed an intense interest in understanding what had happened to his son, asked the question that had been bothering him since the attack. Why didn't it come back? Everything I've read about predators says they return to finish wounded prey. That's a common misconception, Dr. Nelson replied. Great whites are not mindless killing machines despite their portrayal in popular culture. They're selective predators with specific dietary preferences. The bite and spit behavior we observed in this case is consistent with what we call investigatory bites. The shark was essentially taste testing to determine if Ethan was appropriate prey, which, as a human, he was not. So I didn't taste good? Ethan asked, finding gallows humor in the situation. Essentially, yes, Dr. Nelson confirmed with a small smile. Humans lack the high blubber content that sharks prefer. When a great white bites a human and releases, it's not showing mercy. It's rejecting what it perceives as unsuitable food. This scientific framing helped demystify the attack, making it less personal and more comprehensible as a natural, if unfortunate, interaction between species. For Ethan, this perspective began the process of reconciling the event intellectually, though the emotional processing would take considerably longer. The documentation complete, the wounds were redressed, and Dr. Nelson prepared to leave. We'd like to include your case in a paper we're preparing on shark encounters during organized water events. All identifying information would remain confidential, of course. Ethan nodded his agreement. If it helps prevent this happening to someone else, I'm all for it. The following day, Ethan underwent the first of his reconstructive surgeries, a 6-hour procedure that replaced the external fixation with internal plates and screws to stabilize the fractured bones. While this was a significant step toward recovery, the surgical team emphasized that soft tissue healing remained the primary concern and limiting factor in his rehabilitation timeline. Bone healing we can predict with reasonable accuracy, Dr. Chen explained during post-operative rounds. Muscle and tendon recovery is more variable, particularly with the degree of damage you sustained. We're optimistic, but patience will be essential. By the end of the second week, Ethan had progressed to sitting up in a chair for short periods, though weight-bearing on his injured leg remained strictly prohibited. Physical therapists worked with him daily, focusing on maintaining strength in his unaffected limbs and preventing the muscle atrophy that rapidly affected immobilized patients, even those as fit as Ethan had been. The psychological impact of the attack began to manifest more clearly during this period. Ethan experienced nightmares in which he relived the moment of impact, waking in cold sweats with his heart racing. During daytime hours, he maintained the positive attitude expected of athletes, focusing on goals, speaking of recovery milestones, but the nights revealed the deeper wounds that physical therapy couldn't address. Dr. Elena Patel, the hospital's psychiatric consultant, was brought in to assess Ethan's mental health needs. Her specialized experience with trauma patients immediately recognized the signs of early post-traumatic stress disorder. What you're experiencing is entirely normal following a life-threatening event, she assured Ethan during their first session. The nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, these are your brain's way of processing what happened and attempting to protect you from similar threats in the future, even when those threats are unlikely to recur, Ethan noted wryly. Exactly, Dr. Patel agreed. The brain's threat detection system isn't always logical. It's designed for survival, not nuance. Our job is to help recalibrate that system to distinguish between actual danger and perceived danger. These sessions became an important component of Ethan's recovery routine, complementing the physical work with the equally essential psychological processing. Dr. Patel introduced techniques for managing flashbacks and anxiety, including mindfulness practices adapted for athletes who were accustomed to physical rather than mental training regimens. 3 weeks after the attack, Ethan was discharged from the hospital to continue his recovery as an outpatient. The transition home, to his parents' house rather than his apartment near campus, where stairs and independence would have posed too many challenges, marked a significant milestone, though the road ahead remained long. His first follow-up appointment included removal of some sutures and the first tentative discussion of weight-bearing. Timelines. We're looking at another 3 to 4 weeks before partial weight-bearing with crutches, Dr. Chen advised. Full weight bearing without support will be determined by your progress, but typically not before 3 months post-injury, for cases of this complexity. These timelines, while necessary for medical planning, reinforced for Ethan the extent to which his life had been altered. The competition season would be long over before he could even consider resuming training. His academic plans required adjustment as well, with the university arranging for remote coursework to accommodate his recovery needs. The attack had receded from public consciousness by this point, though occasional media inquiries still reached the Ward family. A producer from a cable documentary series about shark attacks requested an interview, offering what they described as an opportunity to tell his story in his own words. Ethan declined, not yet ready to revisit the experience for public consumption. Within the local community, however, interest remained. The La Jolla lifeguard station had seen an increase in visitors asking about shark safety, and Carlos found himself giving impromptu educational talks during his shifts. Rather than fueling fear, he used these opportunities to provide context and accurate information. Sharks have been in these waters for millions of years, he would explain to concerned beachgoers. We're visitors in their environment. Understanding their behavior and taking reasonable precautions allows us to share the ocean safely. The precautions he outlined were the standard recommendations of marine safety organizations. Avoid swimming. At dawn and dusk, when sharks are most active, stay in groups rather than swimming alone. Remove jewelry that might reflect light, like fish scales. Avoid areas where fishing is occurring or where seals congregate. Sensible advice that acknowledged risk without exaggerating it. For Ethan, the return to water would require more than physical healing. It would demand psychological readiness that couldn't be forced or scheduled. His father, recognizing this, broached the subject carefully during Ethan's 6th week of recovery. "I've been thinking," Robert said as they sat on the back porch of the family home, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors remarkably similar to those that had greeted the ill-fated race day. "When you're ready, and only when you're ready, we might start with the pool at the recreation center. No pressure, no timeline." Ethan nodded, appreciating both the suggestion and the lack of expectation attached to it. The thought of returning to water, any water, still triggered an involuntary tension in his body, a physiological response that no amount of rational understanding had yet overcome. "I'd like that," he said after a moment. "Not yet, but someday." The conversation lingered in Ethan's mind as he attended his next physical therapy session. Dylan Rivera, his therapist, had been a collegiate swimmer before pursuing his medical career, giving him insight into the athletic mindset that proved invaluable during their work together. "How's the pain level today?" Dylan asked as they began their session. "Manageable," Ethan replied, the standard answer from patients who prided themselves on pain tolerance. Dylan nodded, knowing better than to challenge this directly. "We're going to focus on proprioception. Today, your brain's awareness of where your leg is in space. This foundation is critical for when we transition to weight-bearing exercises." The session proceeded with exercises that seemed simple, but required intense concentration. Identifying without looking which toe was being touched, replicating positions with the uninjured leg, mapping imaginary paths with the foot while lying supine. These built the neural pathways that would eventually support more complex movements. "You're making excellent progress," Dylan observed as they finished. "The residual swelling is decreasing, and your range of motion is improving ahead of schedule." Ethan appreciated the positive reinforcement, but remained realistic about the gulf between his current capabilities and his pre-attack performance levels. "How many athletes have you worked with after injuries like this?" he asked. "Shark attacks specifically? You're my first," Dylan admitted. "But I've worked with patients who've suffered comparable traumatic injuries, motor vehicle accidents, industrial incidents. Several have returned to athletic activity, though often with adaptations." "Adaptations," Ethan repeated, considering the word and its implications. It suggested neither full recovery nor defeat, but something in between, a recalibration of expectations and methods. "One of my patients was a marathon runner who lost function in her tibialis anterior after an accident," Dylan offered. "We worked with orthotics and technique modifications. She completed a half-marathon 16 months after her injury, slower than her previous pace, but an incredible achievement considering the prognosis she initially received." This concrete example provided something Ethan had been lacking, a realistic vision of possibility that acknowledged limitations without surrendering to them completely. It wasn't the clean narrative of triumphant return that sports culture often celebrated, but it was authentic and achievable. As Ethan approached the 2-month mark post-attack, he reached another significant milestone, the transition to partial weight bearing with crutches. This seemingly small step represented a dramatic expansion of his world, reducing his dependence on others and allowing greater self-sufficiency. The psychological benefits were as significant as the physical ones. Being upright, moving through space under his own power rather than in a wheelchair, shifted Ethan's perspective literally and figuratively. Hospital corridors and doorways that had seemed imposing obstacles became manageable challenges. The horizon of possibility expanded with each assisted step. It was during this period that Ethan received an unexpected communication, an email from Thomas Jensen, the race director for the La Jolla Open Waters Challenge. "I hope this message finds you recovering well," Jensen wrote. "I'm reaching out because our organization is reviewing safety protocols for next year's event, and we'd value your input as someone with direct experience of the limitations in our current system." Ethan was initially hesitant, unsure if he was ready to engage with anything related to the event that had so dramatically altered his life. After discussion with Dr. Patel, however, he recognized the potential therapeutic value in contributing to safety improvements that might prevent similar incidents. The meeting, conducted via video conference to accommodate Ethan's limited mobility, included Jensen, representatives from the County Marine Safety Division, and a marine biologist specializing in shark behavior. Rather than focusing exclusively on the attack, they discussed broader questions of risk management in open water events. "We're considering additional safety boats, particularly at the turn buoys where swimmers are more exposed," Jensen explained, "and drone surveillance before and during the swim portion. The question is where to direct resources for maximum effect without creating a false sense of absolute security." Ethan found himself engaged by these practical considerations, his perspective as both an athlete and attack survivor, adding dimensions that the safety experts, for all their technical knowledge, couldn't provide. "From the water, we can't see the safety boats unless they're quite close," he pointed out. "More boats might help response time, but they won't make swimmers feel safer. Drones might actually be visible to us during the swim, which could provide psychological reassurance." The discussion continued for over an hour, ranging from technical considerations to communication strategies for accurately conveying risk to participants. By its conclusion, Ethan felt a subtle shift in his relationship to what had happened, no longer merely a victim of circumstances, but a contributor to solutions. This engagement with the future, rather than fixation on the past, continued to characterize Ethan's recovery as the 3-month mark approached. Physical therapy had progressed to more challenging exercises, including partial weight bearing in a therapy pool, his first return to water since the attack. The initial session had been emotionally charged, with Ethan experiencing elevated heart rate and breathing difficulties before even entering the water. Dr. Patel had prepared him with cognitive techniques for managing this anxiety, focusing on the fundamental differences between the controlled pool environment and the open ocean where the attack had occurred. "Notice the clear water," she had advised during their preparation session. "Notice the solid bottom, the defined edges. These tangible differences help your brain distinguish between then and now, between danger and safety." Dylan had been equally supportive during the actual session, allowing Ethan to set the pace for water entry and maintaining constant communication throughout. The breakthrough came not as a dramatic moment, but as a gradual realization. Minutes passing in chest-deep water with decreasing anxiety, movement becoming more fluid as tension diminished, focus shifting from fear to the therapeutic exercises themselves. By the 4th pool session, Ethan was able to briefly submerge his face, an action that had triggered panic attacks in early attempts. This progression mirrored his physical recovery, each small victory building toward larger capabilities. Outside the structured therapy environment, Ethan had begun contemplating his academic and athletic future. The university had been accommodating, allowing him to complete a semester remotely, but decisions about the coming year required attention. Similarly, his position on the triathlon team remained open, but realistic assessment of his competitive future could no longer be postponed. These considerations led to a meeting with Coach Thompson, who visited the ward home in early July, just over 3 months after the attack. They sat in the backyard, Ethan now able to move short distances with a single crutch, his gait uneven but improving. "The Federation's granted you injury status through next season," Thompson began, addressing the administrative aspects first. "Your qualifying times from last year will carry over once you're cleared to compete again." Ethan nodded, appreciating the practical support while recognizing the gap between administrative clearance and actual competitive readiness. "And if I'm not cleared?" he asked. "Or if I can compete, but not at the same level?" Thompson, who had coached athletes through various injuries over his 20-year career, recognized the crucial nature of this question. "Then we adapt," he said simply. "Your scholarship isn't contingent on performance metrics while you're on medical recovery status. As for competition levels, we cross that bridge when we reach it, with a focus on what you can do rather than what you can't." This pragmatic approach, neither overly optimistic nor pessimistic, aligned with Ethan's own evolving perspective. The absolutism of his pre-attack worldview, where success was measured in milliseconds and performance rankings, had given way to a more nuanced understanding of achievement and value. The meeting concluded with tentative plans for Ethan's return to campus in the fall, with accommodations for his continuing rehabilitation needs. While he wouldn't resume training with the team immediately, maintaining connection with that community was identified as an important component of his recovery. As the conversation shifted to more general topics, Thompson mentioned a development that had occurred since their last interaction. "The marine conservation group that works with the university is launching an educational initiative about sharks," he said. "They're looking for someone who can speak to coexistence rather than fear. I thought you might have interest once you're ready." Ethan considered this unexpected direction. Before the attack, marine conservation had been peripheral to his consciousness, something he vaguely supported but didn't actively engage with. Now, having experienced the powerful reality of shark encounters, he found himself increasingly drawn to understanding these creatures beyond the narrow context of his traumatic experience. "I'd like to learn more about it," he replied, recognizing both the potential value of such involvement and the psychological work still needed before he could effectively serve as an advocate rather than merely a cautionary tale. The summer progressed with incremental improvements in Ethan's condition. By mid-August, 4.5 months post-attack, he had advanced to walking short distances without support, though with a pronounced limp that reflected the ongoing muscle imbalance and joint stiffness. The surgical scars had faded from angry red to silvery pink, forming an unmistakable pattern across his right leg that drew occasional stares when visible below his shorts. These physical markers were accompanied by less visible but equally significant psychological healing. The nightmares had decreased in frequency, and while certain triggers still prompted anxiety, footage of sharks on television, the sound of waves breaking, Ethan had developed effective strategies for managing these responses. His relationship with the ocean remained complex. He had visited the beach several times, sitting on the sand but not yet venturing into the water. Each visit extended his comfort zone slightly, moving closer to the tide line, allowing the foam of spent waves to touch his feet, watching swimmers and surfers, without the immediate grip of panic that had characterized earlier attempts. It was during one such visit on a clear August afternoon that Ethan encountered Carlos for the first time since the hospital. The lifeguard was off duty, jogging along the shoreline, when he spotted Ethan seated on a beach towel near the lifeguard tower. "Good to see you out here," Carlos said, pausing his run to chat. "How's the recovery coming along?" "Better every week," Ethan replied, gesturing to the walking cane resting beside him. "Still a work in progress, but moving forward." Carlos nodded, understanding both the progress made and the distance still to go. "I saw your case in the county's annual water safety report," he mentioned. "They're using it to improve response protocols for the triathlon next year." "I've been working with them on that," Ethan confirmed, trying to make something constructive come from what happened. The conversation continued briefly, touching on Ethan's plans for the coming semester and Carlos's recent certification as a water safety instructor. As they were about to part ways, Carlos hesitated, then asked the question that had lingered in his mind since the rescue. "Do you remember Much from that day, from the water, I mean. Ethan looked out at the ocean, contemplating how to answer. Fragments, he finally said. Clear images separated by blank spaces. I remember the impact, the cold, the color of the water when I was underneath. He paused. And I remember your voice saying you had me. That part's very clear. Carlos nodded, knowing from experience that trauma memories often form this way. Intense sensory snapshots, rather than continuous narrative. If you ever want to talk through those fragments, fill in some of the blanks, I'm around. This offer, made without pressure or expectation, provided another potential avenue for processing what had happened. The official reports, medical records, and second-hand accounts offered one perspective, but the lived experience, shared only by Ethan and those who had been in the water with him, remained partially inaccessible due to the nature of traumatic memory. As Carlos continued his run, Ethan remained on the beach, watching the rhythmic motion of the waves. Each white cap forming, cresting, and dissolving represented the eternal cycle that had continued undisturbed by the momentary intersection of human and shark lives. The ocean held no malice for what had happened, nor did it offer apology. It simply was powerful, beautiful, dangerous in its indifference. In the weeks that followed, Ethan returned to campus for the fall semester, now able to navigate the university environment with minimal accommodation. He attended classes in person, maintained his dorm room independently, and participated in modified training sessions with the triathlon team, focusing on upper body strength and controlled rehabilitation exercises. The Shark Conservation Group that Coach Thompson had mentioned reached out again, this time with a specific proposal for an educational program targeting youth athletes involved in ocean sports. The concept resonated with Ethan, who had been developing his own thoughts about responsible coexistence with marine predators. We're not looking for sensationalism, explained Dr. Maria Gonzalez, the marine biologist heading the initiative. Quite the opposite. We want to replace fear-based messaging with respect-based understanding. Your personal experience combined with scientific context could be incredibly powerful. Ethan agreed to participate in the development phase, contributing his perspective to educational materials that would eventually reach junior lifeguard programs, youth swim teams, and school groups throughout Southern California. This involvement provided an additional dimension to his recovery, a sense of purpose that transcended personal rehabilitation. As the one-year anniversary of the attack approached, Ethan faced decisions about competitive participation in the coming season. His physical recovery had progressed remarkably, thanks to his age, fitness level, and dedicated rehabilitation. He could run again, though not with his former speed or endurance. He could cycle competitively, the rotational movement less affected by his lingering limitations than the impact forces of running. Swimming remained the most significant challenge, both physically and psychologically. He had progressed to lap swimming in the university pool, but open water training, a necessity for triathlon competition, presented a barrier he had not yet overcome. The decision process involved numerous conversations with coaches, medical professionals, and family members, all of whom offered perspectives without attempting to direct his choice. Ultimately, it was a conversation with Marcus that provided the clarity Ethan needed. "I've been thinking about competing in the aquabike division," Ethan mentioned as they stretched after a training session. Aquabike events featured the swim and bike portions of triathlon without the run, a format that might accommodate his current capabilities. "Makes sense," Marcus replied. "Good transition option." He paused, then added, "You know no one expects you to come back at all, right? The fact that you're even considering competition again is already beyond what most people thought possible." This simple acknowledgement, that expectations had been recalibrated without him fully recognizing it, shifted Ethan's perspective on his decision. He had been measuring his options against his pre-attack standards, finding all of them lacking. But when viewed against the prognosis he had received in those first hospital days, even limited competition represented remarkable progress. The actual anniversary of the attack arrived with less emotional impact than Ethan had anticipated. He spent the day engaged in normal activities, attending classes, completing a physical, therapy session, studying with friends. The date's significance remained present in his awareness, but it did not dominate his experience as he had feared it might. That evening, he visited La Jolla Cove alone, arriving as the setting sun painted the water in colors reminiscent of that fateful morning. He had not planned specific actions for this pilgrimage, needing only to be present in the space where his life had so dramatically changed course. The beach was quiet, weekday evening visitors scattered along its length. Ethan found a spot near the water's edge, removed his shoes and allowed the cool Pacific to wash over his feet. The water felt as it always had, neither malevolent nor benign, simply elemental. As darkness fell, he remained at the shore, watching the progression of stars appearing overhead. Somewhere beyond the breaking waves, marine life continued its ancient patterns: predator and prey, movement and rest, life and death. The great white that had altered his existence had no awareness of her impact, concerned only with her own survival in an increasingly challenging environment. Ethan found an unexpected peace in this realization that his story was simultaneously profoundly significant and entirely incidental depending on the perspective from which it was viewed. In the human world of athletic achievement and medical recovery, his experience represented a dramatic narrative of survival and adaptation. In the broader context of natural systems, it was merely one of countless interactions occurring in shared environments. Both perspectives held truth, and the integration of these seemingly contradictory viewpoints formed the foundation of his evolving relationship with the ocean and its inhabitants. He would never again enter the water with the casual confidence of his pre-attack self, but neither would he be defined solely by what had happened on that April morning. The shark had long since moved on, continuing her solitary patrol of the California coast. Driven by instincts honed through millions of years of evolution, the ocean had absorbed the momentary disruption of its surface, returning to its eternal rhythms. And Ethan Ward, forever changed but not diminished, took his first steps into waters that would always be both familiar and strange, carrying with him the physical scars and hard-won wisdom of one who had glimpsed the wild heart of the natural world and emerged to tell the tale.